Jessica Coleman had always lived a relatively quiet life. Married to Daniel for 7 years, they had settled into what most would call a comfortable routine. Jessica was the kind of woman who enjoyed life's simple pleasures, weekend brunches, movie nights with her husband, and the occasional trip to a nearby lake. Daniel was the stable provider, always reliable and considerate. And while their life seemed picture-perfect on the outside, Jessica felt something missing. A certain spark, a thrill she hadn't felt in years. One night, as Jessica scrolled through TikTok while Daniel was out on a work trip, she stumbled upon a viral video. The creator was a man named Ethan Reed, a popular TikToker in his late 20s. Ethan had the kind of charisma that drew people in effortlessly. With over 5 million followers, he was known for his charm, playful attitude, and a sharp wit. His videos were lighthearted, filled with pranks, jokes, and occasionally collaborations with other influencers. But what really caught Jessica's attention was how he effortlessly seemed to flirt with his audience, almost as if he were speaking directly to her. It started innocently enough. Jessica followed Ethan's account, commenting on a few of his videos. To her surprise, Ethan responded to one of her comments. It was casual, nothing too forward, but just enough to give her a little rush of excitement. Over the next few weeks, their interactions became more frequent, moving from the comment section to private messages. Ethan was funny, engaging, and, most of all, he made her feel special, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Jessica hadn't told anyone about her growing connection with Ethan, not even her closest friends. It was their little secret. She justified it to herself, telling herself that it was just harmless fun. After all, they had never met in person. That is, until Ethan suggested they collaborate on a TikTok video together. "I've seen some of your posts, Jessica. You've got a great presence. Ever thought about doing a TikTok collab?" he asked one evening. Jessica hesitated. The idea of meeting him in person was thrilling, but it also crossed a line she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Yet, the temptation was undeniable. After a long internal debate, she agreed, telling herself that it was just for fun, and nothing serious would happen. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday afternoon in a nearby city, where they could film a casual video at a trendy coffee shop. Daniel had no idea. He thought Jessica was meeting up with an old college friend that day. The secrecy, the lies. Jessica tried to push down the guilt, focusing on the excitement instead. When she met Ethan in person, the connection was instant. He was even more charming in real life, his smile infectious and his energy magnetic. They filmed the video without any issues, laughing together as they played off each other's banter for the camera. For a brief moment, Jessica felt alive again, swept up in a world so different from her everyday life. The video was uploaded to Ethan's account later that evening. Jessica had hoped Daniel wouldn't see it. After all, he rarely used TikTok and wasn't the type to follow popular trends. But, as fate would have it, the video made its way into his recommended feed, an algorithmic betrayal that would set everything in motion. It was a typical evening when Daniel saw the video. He had been scrolling through his phone while relaxing after a long day at work when the video popped up. At first, he didn't recognize the woman in the video, but the longer he watched, the more the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Jessica, laughing, flirting, and looking more carefree than she had in years, except it wasn't with him. It was with Ethan, the TikToker who Daniel vaguely remembered hearing about in passing from Jessica's social media ramblings. But something about the way she looked at Ethan, the ease with which they interacted, made Daniel feel sick to his stomach. Was it just a simple collaboration? Or was there more going on behind the scenes? Daniel couldn't sleep that night. He tried to dismiss his suspicions, telling himself that Jessica would never betray him. Yet, the image of her with Ethan wouldn't leave his mind. Something was off, and he needed answers. What Jessica didn't know was that her perfect little secret was about to unravel in the most unexpected way possible. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of unease after seeing that video. His mind raced with questions, his heart heavy with doubt. Though Jessica had never given him a reason to suspect her before, the way she and Ethan interacted on screen just didn't sit right. It was too natural, too comfortable. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something inside him told him he wasn't imagining things. The following morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee while Jessica hummed a tune, blissfully unaware of his suspicions. He hadn't mentioned the video yet, still trying to figure out how to approach it without sounding paranoid. But as he watched her move around the kitchen, his stomach churned with the weight of the unspoken tension. "Hey, Jess," Daniel finally said, his voice careful. "I saw something interesting on TikTok last night." Jessica paused, a slight tremor in her hand as she placed a plate on the table. "Oh? What did you see?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her heart began to race. "A video of you with that TikToker, Ethan. What's his name? Reed." Daniel's eyes were on her now, studying her reaction. Jessica's heart sank. She hadn't expected Daniel to find the video so quickly, if at all. Trying to remain composed, she forced a smile and shrugged. "Oh, that. Yeah, we did a little collaboration. It was fun. Nothing serious." "Really? You never mentioned it," Daniel said, his tone still neutral, but there was an edge beneath his words. "When did this happen?" Jessica's mind raced as she searched for an explanation. "Just last weekend. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I didn't bother telling you." Daniel nodded slowly, but inside, his mind was screaming. The way she brushed it off only added to his suspicion. Why wouldn't she mention meeting someone like Ethan? Why the secrecy? And why did they seem so close in the video? "Well, it's good to see you having fun," Daniel said after a long pause, his words deliberate, testing her. Jessica felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She hated lying to him, but what could she say? That she had been secretly messaging a TikToker for weeks, craving the attention he gave her? That meeting Ethan had filled a void she didn't even know existed? She pushed the thoughts aside, telling herself it was harmless, that nothing had happened between them. Yet, the next few days were tense, though Jessica tried to act like everything was normal. She didn't know that Daniel was watching her more closely, noticing every glance at her phone. Every time she excused herself for errands that suddenly became more frequent. Daniel didn't confront her again. He needed proof, something concrete that would confirm his worst fears. One evening, Daniel decided to take matters into his own hands. While Jessica was out supposedly running errands, he accessed her laptop, which he had carelessly left open. His hands trembled as he scrolled through her search history, hoping, praying, that he was wrong. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. But then, he found a series of searches about TikTok content creation, followed by a flurry of messages exchanged with Ethan on social media. There it was, flirty messages, private jokes, and even mentions of their meetup. Jessica had kept their connection hidden for much longer than Daniel realized. The messages weren't explicit, but the tone was unmistakable. They weren't just collaborating on videos. They had built something personal, something that went beyond what she had told him. His breath caught in his throat as he scrolled further, his heart pounding in his chest. The betrayal was slowly becoming clearer, but what hurt most was that Jessica had been sneaking around behind his back, keeping this entire part of her life secret. Daniel sat back, his mind reeling. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but the evidence was right in front of him. Jessica was emotionally invested in Ethan, more than she'd ever admit. And as far as Daniel was concerned, this wasn't just a harmless flirtation. It was something that could destroy their marriage. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Daniel made a decision. He would confront her, not with anger, but with a plan. If Jessica was indeed hiding something more than just casual messages, he would catch her in the act. He wouldn't simply accuse her. He needed to see the truth for himself. That's when Daniel came up with an idea. He would set a trap, one that Jessica wouldn't see coming. He had noticed from the messages that Ethan was planning to visit their city again soon. There had been talk about another collaboration, though Jessica hadn't mentioned it to Daniel yet. He decided he would wait for that opportunity and see if Jessica would take the bait. As the days passed, Daniel played the part of the unsuspecting husband, giving no hint that he knew about her hidden world with Ethan. Jessica, feeling more confident that she had covered her tracks, continued her interactions with Ethan, oblivious to the fact that Daniel had already seen everything. And then, one evening, Jessica casually mentioned she was going out again, this time to meet with friends. She tried to sound nonchalant, but Daniel's stomach churned with the familiar feeling of dread. "Have fun," Daniel said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He kissed her on the cheek, knowing full well that this might be the night where everything fell apart. Jessica walked out the door, leaving Daniel behind. But little did she know, this time, Daniel wasn't staying home. He had a plan, and tonight, the truth would finally come to light. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Jessica leave the house. He gave her enough time to get a good distance away before grabbing his keys and heading to his car. His mind was racing. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The messages he had found were enough to convince him that Jessica and Ethan were meeting again, likely for more than just a collab. He'd tracked Jessica's phone earlier in the day and noted the address she had used to plan the meetup with Ethan. It was a trendy rooftop bar in the city, the kind of place Daniel knew Jessica loved but never bothered suggesting to him. She'd always claimed they didn't have time for those spontaneous outings anymore, but apparently, she had all the time in the world for Ethan. As Daniel drove, he tried to steady his nerves. His hands were sweaty on the wheel, and he felt nauseous. This wasn't something he ever thought he'd have to do. Follow his wife to catch her in the act of cheating. He still clung to a sliver of hope that maybe he was wrong. Maybe this was all some misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. By the time he reached the rooftop bar, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, orange glow. The bar was bustling with life, couples and groups laughing under the fairy lights strung across the outdoor seating area. Daniel parked his car a block away and walked the rest of the distance, his heart racing with every step. As he approached the bar's entrance, he spotted her. Jessica stood at the edge of the patio, her back to him, laughing softly as Ethan leaned in close, whispering something in her ear. Ethan's hand rested casually on her lower back, a gesture too familiar for Daniel's liking. They weren't just colleagues filming a TikTok video. They were too close, their body language screaming something more intimate than what Jessica had been pretending. Daniel froze in place, hidden behind a row of potted plants near the entrance. He watched them for a few moments, feeling a wave of nausea and anger swell inside him. Jessica's laughter sounded so different, lighter, freer than it had in months. She looked at Ethan the way she hadn't looked at Daniel in years. It was as if she had transformed into someone he didn't recognize, someone who had left their marriage behind without a second thought. He wanted to storm over, confront them right then and there, but he held back. He needed more than just a scene. He needed to see exactly how far this betrayal had gone. He watched as Jessica and Ethan moved to a quieter part of the bar, away from the crowd, taking a seat in a dimly lit corner booth. The intimacy between them was undeniable now. Ethan's arm draped casually over the back of the booth, his fingers grazing Jessica's shoulder. She was leaning into him, her body language relaxed, comfortable in his presence. Daniel's pulse quickened. He pulled out his phone, snapping a few pictures from a distance, evidence he could confront her with later. But even as he took the photos, he felt a sinking feeling. Did he really need these pictures? Wasn't what he was seeing in front of him enough? As he watched them from afar, Jessica glanced at her phone, and for a brief moment, Daniel panicked, thinking she might notice his presence or suspect something. But instead, she smiled at a message, then placed her phone face down on the table, her attention fully on Ethan once more. Ethan leaned in closer, whispering something that made Jessica blush, her hand resting on his thigh under the table. That was it. The final confirmation Daniel had dreaded. This wasn't just some innocent collaboration. They were together, emotionally and physically, and Jessica had been lying to him for weeks, possibly months. Daniel clenched his fists, the anger boiling inside him. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest as he watched the woman he loved share an intimate moment with someone else. His mind was racing, thinking of all the times she'd looked him in the eye and lied. All the moments she pretended everything was fine while sneaking around behind his back. Unable to bear it any longer, Daniel walked away, back to his car. He didn't confront them, not yet. There would be time for that later, when Jessica returned home, thinking she had gotten away with it. But the confrontation that was coming would be worse than anything she could imagine. Daniel wasn't the type to let something like this slide. He had seen enough to know the truth, and now he had to decide what to do with it. As he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, Daniel made up his mind. He would confront her tonight, but not in anger. He would make her tell him the truth, force her to admit what she had done. And once she did, there would be no going back. Their marriage, everything they had built together, was about to collapse in ways she never expected. The night felt heavy with tension as Daniel drove home, each passing streetlight casting long shadows over the road. He didn't feel relief, only a sense of dread for what was to come. Jessica would come home, pretending everything was fine, completely unaware that her world was about to shatter. And Daniel, sitting in the dark living room waiting for her, would be the one to break it. The house was dark when Daniel arrived home. He left the lights off, sitting in the living room with only the glow from his phone illuminating the space. He didn't want to face Jessica in a blaze of fury. That would be too easy. No, he needed her to confess, to see the weight of her lies come crashing down on her as she realized he knew everything. His mind played over the image of her with Ethan. How comfortable she had seemed, how easily she had discarded their life for something fleeting. He checked his phone, watching Jessica's location through the tracking app he had secretly installed. She was still at the rooftop bar with Ethan, her phone staying in one place. Daniel waited, every second feeling like an hour. His mind ran wild with thoughts of what they might be doing now, but he quickly pushed them away. It didn't matter. Whatever had happened between them was already enough to destroy their marriage. About an hour later, Jessica's location finally started to move. She was on her way home. Daniel's heart pounded harder as the minutes dragged on. He could almost hear the ticking of an invisible clock counting down to the moment she would walk through the door. And then, as if on cue, he heard the familiar click of the front door unlocking. The door creaked open, and Jessica stepped inside, quietly closing it behind her. She flicked on the light, unaware of Daniel's presence in the living room. "Hey, honey," she called out softly, her voice casual as if nothing had changed. "I'm home." Daniel didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the ground, letting the silence stretch on. He could hear her footsteps as she walked through the hallway, heading toward the kitchen. She was probably going to grab a glass of water, unwind from what she thought was just another night of getting away with her secret life. But then, she turned the corner and saw him. "Daniel?" Jessica stopped in her tracks, her voice wavering slightly. "What are you doing sitting here in the dark?" Daniel slowly lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. "I've been waiting for you," Daniel said calmly, though his voice carried a weight that made Jessica's heart skip a beat. "Oh," Jessica's voice faltered, and she forced a smile. "Well, I'm home now. We can go to bed if you want. I didn't think you'd still be up." "Where were you tonight, Jess?" Daniel asked, his tone unervingly calm. Jessica blinked, her smile faltering. She wasn't expecting the question, not like this. I told you. I was out with friends," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Friends," Daniel repeated, the word hanging in the air. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Jessica's stomach dropped. There was something in Daniel's voice, something that made her skin prickle with unease. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe he knew more than he was letting on. I mean, yeah," Jessica stammered. "What's going on, Daniel? Why are you acting like this?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before he turned it toward her. The screen displayed a photo, the one he had taken earlier that evening, of her and Ethan together at the rooftop bar. Jessica's face paled as she saw it, her heart plummeting to the pit of her stomach. "Do you want to tell me what this is?" Daniel asked, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made it clear there was no going back now. Jessica's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flooding her at once. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was no point in lying anymore. Daniel had caught her. He knew. "Daniel, she began, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." "Not what it looks like?" Daniel interrupted, his calm facade cracking just slightly. "Then tell me, Jess, what is it?" Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes as she stood there, her mind scrambling for some explanation, some way to fix this. But the weight of her deception was too heavy, the lies too tangled. She had been caught, and there was no escaping the truth. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Jessica finally whispered, her voice breaking. "I swear, Daniel, I never wanted to hurt you." Daniel's jaw clenched as he stood up, his eyes locked on hers. "You didn't mean for this to happen? You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me for God knows how long, and you didn't mean for it to happen?" Jessica wiped at her eyes, the tears spilling over now. It got out of control. "I didn't think it would go this far." Daniel's heart twisted painfully in his chest. He wanted to scream at her, to yell and demand why she had done this to him. But the hurt went deeper than that. He felt betrayed in a way he never thought possible. His voice was low and steady when he spoke again. "Do you love him?" Daniel asked, the question hanging in the air like a knife. Jessica shook her head frantically. No, it's not like that. I don't love him, Daniel, I swear. It was just a stupid fling. It didn't mean anything." Daniel stared at her, his face expressionless. "It didn't mean anything? You were with him tonight, weren't you?" Jessica couldn't bring herself to answer. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, knowing that her silence was all the answer Daniel needed. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You didn't even have the decency to come clean, did you? You were just going to keep lying, keep sneaking around." "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Daniel." "Sorry?" Daniel's voice broke. "Sorry doesn't change what you did. Sorry doesn't fix this." Jessica collapsed into a chair, her sobs filling the room. Daniel stood there, staring at her as if she were a stranger, someone he no longer recognized. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been broken, hung heavy in the air. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore, Jess. I can't be with someone who would do this to me." Jessica looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "Daniel, please, we can work through this. I'll end it with Ethan, I swear. I'll do anything." But Daniel just shook his head. "It's too late. You've already destroyed us." And with that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jessica behind, her world crashing down around her. The door slammed shut behind Daniel, the sound reverberating through the quiet house. Jessica sat frozen in her chair, the weight of her world collapsing around her. The sobs that had racked her moments ago had subsided into a numbness that seemed to fill every part of her being. Her mind raced, trying to grasp what had just happened. She wanted to run after Daniel, to beg him to stay, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the floor by the reality of her betrayal. She had never thought it would end like this. She had never imagined that her secret relationship with Ethan, which had started as a harmless flirtation, would lead to this point, a point of no return. Now, everything was ruined. After what felt like an eternity, Jessica finally forced herself to stand. She wiped her tear-streaked face with trembling hands and stumbled toward the bedroom. The silence of the house was suffocating, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every breath she took. It felt like the walls were closing in on her. When she reached the bedroom, the sight of Daniel's things, his jacket draped over the chair, his half-read book on the nightstand, hit her like a punch to the gut. It was a painful reminder of everything they had built together and everything she had just destroyed. As she collapsed onto the bed, her phone buzzed on the bedside table. She ignored it at first, but after several seconds, curiosity and dread got the better of her. She reached for the phone, expecting another message from Ethan, probably asking her how the night had gone. But when she saw the screen, her heart dropped. It wasn't Ethan. It was Daniel. The text was brief, cold, and final. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight. I'll be back tomorrow to get my things. This is over, Jess." The words felt like knives cutting into her, each one slicing deeper than the last. She reread the message over and over, hoping that somehow she had misunderstood, that there was still a way to salvage what they had. But the meaning was clear. Daniel was done. He had given her no chance to explain, no opportunity for reconciliation. Jessica sat in the darkness, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. How had she let things get so out of control? She had been drawn to Ethan because of the thrill, the excitement he brought into her life. But now, that excitement had turned into devastation. Ethan had given her attention and validation, but at what cost? Was it worth losing her marriage? Her home? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. There was no undoing what had been done. The hours dragged on, and sleep never came. Jessica spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her relationship with Daniel in her mind. She thought about the early years, when they had been so happy and in love, when every day had felt like a new adventure. She thought about how their relationship had slowly drifted into a routine, how they had both stopped putting in the effort to keep the spark alive. And then she thought about Ethan, how he had made her feel alive again, desired in a way she hadn't felt in years. But none of that mattered anymore. The next morning, Jessica was jolted out of her thoughts by the sound of the front door opening. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, her body tensing. She knew it was Daniel. He had come back for his things, just like he had said in his text. She wanted to run downstairs, to throw herself at his feet and beg for forgiveness, but a part of her knew it would be useless. She sat frozen on the bed, listening as Daniel moved around downstairs, his footsteps methodical and determined. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't lingering either. Every step was deliberate, a reminder that he was leaving her for good. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps paused. Jessica knew he was standing at the base of the stairs, maybe debating whether to come up and say one last thing, or maybe to just walk out without another word. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. And then, without a single word, the front door opened and closed again. He was gone. Jessica rushed to the window, pulling the curtain back just in time to see Daniel's car pulling out of the driveway. She watched as the car disappeared down the street, leaving her standing alone in the empty house that had once been filled with their shared life. The weight of the moment finally hit her, and she sank to the floor, her chest heaving with silent sobs. Daniel wasn't coming back. She had destroyed the one thing in her life that had been real, and now there was no way to fix it. Daniel drove away from the house without looking back. The early morning sun glared through his windshield, but it felt cold, disconnected from the warmth it was supposed to provide. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as the reality of the situation settled over him like a thick fog. It was over. He had spent the night in a cheap hotel, tossing and turning, wondering if he was doing the right thing. Part of him had wanted to confront Jessica again, to demand more answers, to understand how everything had gone so wrong. But the truth was, there was nothing left to say. She had made her choices, and now, he had to make his. His mind flashed back to the night before, to the moment he had seen her with Ethan. That image, of Jessica laughing with another man, touching him as if Daniel didn't exist, played on a loop in his head. The pain was still fresh, raw, but underneath it was something even more unbearable, the sense of betrayal. Jessica hadn't just cheated on him. She had broken the trust that had been the foundation of their relationship. As he drove, Daniel tried to imagine what his life would be like without her. For the first time in 7 years, he was truly alone. The idea of starting over seemed overwhelming, but the thought of staying with Jessica after what she had done was even worse. There was no coming back from this, no way to rebuild what had been shattered. He pulled into the parking lot of a coffee shop, parking his car but not getting out. He just sat there, staring at nothing, letting the weight of the past 24 hours settle over him. He had made the right decision, hadn't he? Daniel wasn't sure of much anymore, but he knew one thing. His life would never be the same again. And as painful as it was to let go of the life he had known with Jessica, he also knew that staying would have been a greater betrayal to himself. He took a deep breath, the reality of his new future slowly sinking in. There was no going back, only forward. But for now, forward felt like an empty road stretching far beyond the horizon, with no clear destination in sight. Jessica stared at the empty space where Daniel's car had been. The house was unbearably quiet now, the silence amplifying the void he had left behind. She moved slowly through the house, as if expecting him to come back, as if she could somehow undo the damage she had caused by pretending it wasn't real. But the truth was inescapable. Daniel was gone, and there was no bringing him back. She walked into the kitchen, her eyes catching on every little thing that belonged to him. The coffee mug he always used, the jacket he'd left draped over the dining room chair. These things were simple reminders of the life they had shared, but now they felt like relics of a distant past. Each one was a painful reminder of the man she had betrayed. She sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, replaying the events of the last few months. It had all started so innocently. She had never planned for it to go this far. At first, Ethan had just been a fun distraction, a way to escape the monotony of her day-to-day life. Jessica had convinced herself that it was harmless, a little flirtation, a few stolen moments that would never mean anything more. But it hadn't stayed harmless. The thrill of her secret connection with Ethan had slowly consumed her, pushing aside her guilt, her commitment to Daniel, and her sense of right and wrong. It had felt good to be wanted again, to feel desirable in a way that Daniel hadn't made her feel in years. Ethan had become an addiction, and she hadn't realized how deep she'd fallen until it was too late. Now, as she sat alone in the kitchen that had once been filled with the sounds of her marriage, laughing, cooking, sharing meals, Jessica felt the full weight of her choices. She had lost everything. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at the screen. It was Ethan. She knew she should ignore it, but her hand reached for the phone before she could stop herself. Ethan. Hey, how are you? Thinking about last night. You okay? Jessica stared at the message, her heart sinking even further. Last night had felt exciting at the time. Meeting him at the rooftop bar, laughing like nothing else mattered. But now, it felt empty. Hollow. It hadn't been worth it. None of it had been. She didn't reply. Instead, she turned the phone off and shoved it into her pocket, the buzzing of notifications silenced along with any remaining desire to keep things going with Ethan. This wasn't his fault, not entirely, but she knew now that her involvement with him had destroyed everything she truly cared about. Jessica looked around the house again, her eyes landing on the photos of her and Daniel. Pictures from their wedding, vacations they had taken, and moments they had shared over the years. She had built a life with him, a life she had carelessly thrown away for the fleeting thrill of something new. And now, all that was left were these empty memories. Meanwhile, Daniel was sitting in the small hotel room he had checked into the night before. He had spent the morning in a fog, wandering aimlessly around the city, trying to clear his mind. But no matter where he went, the weight of the last 24 hours followed him. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too deep. He hadn't planned what came next. He hadn't even told his friends or family what had happened. It was too painful to admit that the life he had thought was solid and secure had been shattered in the span of a few weeks. Jessica had been everything to him, and now, she felt like a stranger. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Daniel stared blankly at the wall. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it. He knew it wasn't Jessica. She hadn't tried to contact him since he left. That hurt in a way he hadn't expected. Part of him had wanted her to fight for their marriage, to prove that she still cared, that she regretted what she had done. But instead, there was only silence. He wondered what she was doing now. Was she still thinking about Ethan? Was she regretting her choices? Or had she already moved on, leaving him behind like he was the one thing holding her back? Daniel's thoughts drifted back to their life before this, before the lies, before the betrayal. They had been happy once. He had loved her with everything he had, never imagining that it could all crumble so easily. But now, he was faced with the reality that love wasn't enough. Trust was the foundation of everything, and without it, their marriage was doomed. Still, as angry and hurt as he was, Daniel couldn't help but feel conflicted. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to somehow find a way to rebuild their life together. But another part, the part that felt betrayed to the core, knew that things could never be the same. He would always see her with Ethan, always wonder if she was thinking about someone else when she looked at him. He let out a long sigh, running his hands through his hair. He didn't know what his future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go back to how things were. The rest of the day passed in a blur for both of them. Jessica stayed holed up in the house, pacing from room to room, trying to make sense of what had happened. She replayed her relationship with Ethan in her mind, searching for the moment when it had crossed the line from harmless fun to something that had wrecked her marriage. But no matter how much she thought about it, she couldn't pinpoint when or why she had let things get so far. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to focus on moving forward, but every step felt like a struggle. He had thought about going back to the house to confront Jessica one last time, to hear her side of the story in full, but he knew that it wouldn't change anything. What she had done, how she had chosen to lie, to betray him, was already etched into his mind. As the sun set, Jessica stood by the window, staring out at the empty street. She had spent the day replaying every conversation, every decision, every lie. And now, she had to face the harsh truth that she had made her choice, and that choice had cost her everything. Daniel wasn't coming back, and deep down, she knew he shouldn't. Jessica woke the next morning, feeling like she hadn't slept at all. Her body ached from the stress, and her mind was clouded with exhaustion and regret. She hadn't heard from Daniel since he left. Every passing hour without contact only confirmed what she had feared the most. He wasn't coming back. The silence of the house, once a comforting refuge, now felt like a prison. The emptiness pressed down on her, suffocating in its stillness. She spent the morning aimlessly wandering from room to room, her eyes falling on things that belonged to Daniel, each one a painful reminder of what she had lost. The jacket he left behind, the book he had been reading, the picture frames filled with memories of their life together. Everything felt like a ghost of their marriage. By noon, Jessica couldn't take it anymore. She picked up her phone, staring at the blank screen, willing herself to send a message to Daniel. She didn't know what to say, but she couldn't bear the silence any longer. She typed and deleted several messages, none of them feeling right. Finally, she settled on something simple. Jessica, Daniel, can we talk? Please. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to see you. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, her heart pounding in her chest. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. She half expected him to ignore her, but to her surprise, the dots appeared on the screen, signaling that he was typing. Her heart skipped a beat. Daniel, I'll come by later to get the rest of my things. That's it. Jessica's chest tightened. His words felt like a punch to the gut. Cold, distant, final. She had hoped for more, some indication that there was still a chance to fix things. But his response made it clear. He was done. She sank down onto the couch, her head in her hands, wondering how everything had spiraled so far out of control. The weight of her actions was crushing now, the realization of just how much she had thrown away for something that meant so little. Later that afternoon, Jessica sat by the window, watching as Daniel's car pulled up to the house. Her stomach twisted with anxiety, her palms sweaty as she prepared herself for what would be their final interaction as husband and wife. She had rehearsed a dozen things she wanted to say to him, but now, as he stepped out of the car, her mind went blank. Daniel walked to the door with purpose, his face set in a hard, emotionless mask. He knocked once, even though he had a key, and Jessica quickly opened the door. She could feel the tension between them immediately. It was thick, palpable, the kind of tension that comes when two people know the end is near. "Hey," Jessica said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Daniel didn't say anything. He just nodded curtly and walked past her, heading toward the bedroom to pack up the rest of his things. Jessica stood frozen in the hallway for a moment, unsure of what to do, before finally following him. She watched as Daniel moved around the room, methodically collecting his clothes, his personal belongings, each one a piece of the life they had shared. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence, and the distance between them felt like an insurmountable chasm. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say something, anything, to stop him, to make him look at her the way he used to. But the words wouldn't come. All she could feel was the crushing weight of guilt and regret. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel zipped up his bag and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that told her everything she needed to know. He was done. Truly done. "Is this really it?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel paused for a moment, his gaze locking with hers for the first time since he arrived. He took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he tried to keep his emotions in check. I don't know what you expect me to say, Jess, Daniel said quietly. You made your choice. I trusted you, and you broke that trust. There's nothing left to talk about. Jessica felt the tears welling up again, but she forced them back. She didn't want to cry in front of him, not now. She didn't deserve his sympathy, and she knew it. But still, the words spilled out before she could stop them. I never meant for any of this to happen, Daniel, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never wanted to hurt you. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm so sorry. Daniel's eyes flickered with a mix of hurt and anger. A mistake, he repeated, his voice laced with bitterness. You didn't just make a mistake, Jess. You lied to me. You cheated. You betrayed everything we built together. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She had no defense, no excuse for what she had done. All she could do was stand there, the weight of her guilt crushing her. Daniel took a step closer, his eyes piercing into hers. Do you even understand what you did? He asked, his voice low and tense. You destroyed us. You destroyed everything. And for what? For some guy you barely know? Was it worth it, Jess? Was he worth it? Jessica shook her head, her tears finally spilling over. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. It wasn't worth it. None of it was worth losing you. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his expression softening just slightly. But then he shook his head, as if shaking off any remaining attachment. It doesn't matter anymore, he said quietly. What's done is done. He turned toward the door, slinging his bag over his shoulder, ready to leave the life they had built behind. Jessica felt a surge of panic rise in her chest, her heart pounding as she realized this was really it. This was the end. Daniel, wait, she began, her voice desperate, but he didn't stop. He walked to the door, his hand on the knob, his back to her as he spoke one last time. Goodbye, Jess. And with that, he opened the door and stepped outside, leaving her standing alone in the silence of their empty home. Daniel didn't look back as he drove away from the house. The streets felt eerily quiet as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road ahead. His chest felt tight, a mixture of anger, sadness, and relief swirling inside him as he put more distance between himself and the life he was leaving behind. It was over. There was no going back now. But even though he knew he had made the right decision, the pain of it still lingered, like an open wound that refused to heal. He had loved Jessica with everything he had, and she had torn that love apart. As the miles passed by, Daniel allowed himself to let go of the future he had once imagined with her. The home they had planned to grow old in, the family they had talked about starting. It was all gone now, nothing more than a painful memory. But with each mile, he felt a little lighter. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay stuck in the past. And as he drove toward an uncertain future, Daniel finally allowed himself to feel the first stirrings of hope. Back at the house, Jessica stood in the doorway, staring out at the empty street, her heart shattered beyond repair. She had lost him, lost everything. And now, she was left with nothing but the wreckage of the life she had destroyed. It was a life she would never get back. And as the darkness settled over the house, Jessica realized that this was the ending she had made for herself. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.